What is your favorite religious holiday, if you have one?
I was going to say Thanksgiving, but that's not really religious.
The civic religion.
Yeah, right. I think I'd go with Ramadan, the month of fasting for Muslims. So I guess 30 days and not just one holiday.
Yeah, kind of the diametrical opposite
Of Thanksgiving.
Of Thanksgiving, too.
Yeah, right.
Mine is Candlemas, which commemorates Jesus' presentation at the temple. But most importantly, it's celebrated in France as La Chandeleur and is the annual crepe holiday.
Meaning you make crepes.
You make crepes. There are all sorts of little rituals you have to do to ensure good luck for the whole next year. It's very fun.
Okay, so far the through line is food or no food, which I guess is actually quite common in religion, so it's not so weird. I was going to say my favorite, as a child at least, and we're really running the gamut here, is Simchat Torah, which is when you have finished reading the Torah through the year and you're going to start over again. And I just liked it because we would march around the outside of the temple and the rabbi would call out things like inexplicably, if you're a White Sox fan, march around. I guess the rabbi must have been a White Sox fan because I'm from DC, otherwise it didn't make any sense. But I would just get up for everything. I was a fake White Sox fan for the evening.
Torah, a feast for the brain.
Oof.
This is Impromptu from Washington Post Opinions, a show that brings you conversations about the news we can't stop thinking about. I'm Drew Goins, author of the Today's Opinions newsletter.
And I'm Molly Roberts, a columnist at The Post. This week, we're talking about religion and that amorphous thing called spirituality.
So the death of Pope Francis has gotten us thinking a lot about the role of religion in today's society. America has been losing its faith for the past several decades, with millions fewer people identifying as Christian, and the number of people unaffiliated with any religion, those nones, steadily rising.
But recent studies find that secularization may be stalling out. And believe it or not, Americans overwhelmingly identify as spiritual in some way. So what's happening here? We're lonelier than ever. Is organized religion the answer to that? What about more disorganized types of faith?
Today we have our colleague Shadi Hamid here to get into all of it with us. Shadi, welcome to Impromptu.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So this is obviously a pretty personal subject, and I figure we might as well just start with that. What is the role of religion in your guys' lives?
So I was raised in the Christian church, in ostensibly a Methodist church that by the time I left for college had seen the writing on the wall, to make a Bible allusion, and removed United Methodist from its name. So it was going the way of the non-denominational evangelical megachurch. I had a really turbulent relationship with the church for a while as I came out as gay, and then actually kind of dived in to a very, very gay-affirming church here in DC and spent a couple of years doing all sorts of like advocacy within the church. And then eventually I just kind of burned out, and I retain a real love for liturgy and ritual and tradition, and I don't get that a whole lot of other places in my life. But as far as spirituality goes, I'm kind of running on empty at the moment.
What about you, Shadi?
I grew up in an observant Muslim household. So we fasted, we prayed, we went to mosque for the Friday prayer. And I've more or less kept that up. I would say that religion does play an important role in my daily life. We're supposed to pray 5 times a day. I don't always get to 5, but I try for it. And like Drew, I'm struggling a little bit on the spirituality metric. I wouldn't quite say that I'm a religious but not spiritual, but sometimes I feel that way, that Islam is very meaningful to me intellectually, but that I don't always feel the presence of God in the way that I would like. Sometimes I feel a sort of detachment, and that's challenging. It's something I'm trying to work on and to try to make my Islamic practice less intellectual and more spiritual. But that is a challenging thing, and I think it'll be, in some sense, a lifelong wrestling.
Yeah, my experience, I think, is quite different from both of yours. I was raised culturally, but nominally Jewish, but I'm Jewish on the wrong side. My mom is not Jewish. I had a bat mitzvah, but it was Venice themed. And my high school also did teach the Bible, but as literature.
Right.
I have appreciated Judaism as kind of a cultural touchstone. I've appreciated knowing what a religious community looks like because, of course, religion is so important in the United States, and to totally not understand it. I can't say I understand some aspects of it at all, but I understand others better than I would if I'd had nothing. And I've enjoyed the holidays, again, just as cultural tradition, as kind of having an added richness to my life. And as far as God goes, I guess I don't really feel any kind of absence that I struggle with because I never really felt a presence. It's just not something that is on my mind very much.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Look at the three of us. Somewhere out there, Abraham just smashed subscribe. But speaking of traditions that go all the way back to antiquity, as conclave comes up, right, and all of the pomp and circumstance and incense and robes and whatnot, this is a time where we really confront, as the whole world watches, the ancientness of religion, which I think is one of its features, right? It's not a bug, whatever these mega churches along the highway would like to tell you. But those churches are like deeply popular too. So it's impossible to look at these millennia old traditions and not see both majesty and, to some extent, datedness. In what ways does Catholicism in particular, top of mind right now, need a little refresh?
Yeah, so I'd say that I'm skeptical of the idea that we need to be constantly refreshing our religions. They're supposed to be, in some sense, fixed and unchangeable, at least in their core premises and doctrines. And if religions are trying to catch the new trend and they're trying to be more modern and more cool, they run the risk of losing what makes them what they are. And that's why the word tradition, I think, is so important. Because I think that for a lot of progressives and folks on the left, we hear the word tradition and we think that we're like trapped into something. But tradition can also be liberating in the sense that being alive in modern America means we're confronted with unlimited choices. There's all these different paths that we can go to, even deciding what exercise class to go to or yoga or meditation. It's endless, and you have to always be choosing. What tradition does is it says, hey, let go. We actually have some structures that are time-tested, and they might seem constraining at first, but once you really get into them and embrace them, you can find a sort of freedom in that constraint. And there's a reason that traditions last for so long, whether it's the Catholic Church or Islam. These are religions that have gone through a lot, and they have the support of billions of people over time, and that says something, that it works at some level for a lot of people.
Shadi, I'm interested in hearing what you think about, say, the role of women in church leadership in Islam or in Catholicism, in any of these religions, the Southern Baptist Convention, where women still cannot be ordained, or, say, the church's stance on something that's very personal for me, homosexuality and same-sex marriage. I'm interested and I'm imputing this term on you, you may disagree, as a traditionalist, what you make of that.
Well, I think we have to understand that our religions were originally revealed in very different contexts. So prophets, whether it's in the 7th century or before Christ, they're speaking to people with patriarchal values, that these are not progressive societies where the notion of gender equality is there. So naturally, religions have to speak to people where they are. And I think this is where it's important to distinguish between what can be changed within a religion and what is eternal. And I think patriarchal practices are something that can be updated and changed. And I've been very heartened to see that in the American Muslim community, you have a movement of what's sometimes called Islamic feminism, where Muslim women are reinterpreting verses of the Quran to be more in line with what they consider to be gender equality. And there's ways to do that. Each text is reinterpreted in the time that we're in. So obviously, if someone in New York City in 2025 is going to read the Quran differently than someone in 7th century Arabia. And that's precisely the way that it should be. That doesn't mean that the text itself is changing, but the interpretation is.
I'm sure we could find someone in Manhattan who reads it exactly the same as somebody in 7th century
That's
Arabia.
true.
There are a lot of people in Manhattan.
If we looked hard enough.
But yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on all of that, but I think it's difficult to find the answer to your question of what can change and what can't, what's eternal or intrinsic to a religion and what's not. Like, I remember even at my Reformed temple when I was going to get bat mitzvahed, my mom wasn't allowed up on the bima. And so we had to do it at the Six and I synagogue downtown, which would let my mom on the bima, because they'll allow a lot of things. They have, they have book talks, like whatever, it's fine. And so
anything goes on the bima at 6th and I.
But I think you could, I to say that you can't allow a Christian woman up on the bima is a pretty core tenet of Judaism. Again, core enough for my really Reformed temple. And, I just don't even know the answer to the question of whether that's something that is core to Judaism or whether that's something that needs to change. And I think that that's why some people get turned off, right? They kind of look at a religion and decide that it's just not for them in this day and age.
Yeah, I think that's right. And ultimately, these are personal questions. We all decide what we think in our own faiths is unchanging versus changeable. So I think this is the push and pull of being an American religious person. We have a strong tradition, to use that term, of individualism, that the individual should always be searching and seeking and finding their true self. But at some point, you should try to be found. Otherwise, it's never going to end. And I think that that's where the structures of religion can be really important. And we are living in a time where Americans, especially young Americans, are increasingly lonely, high levels of depression and mental illness, deaths of despair. We all know that something is fundamentally wrong in our society. And I'm a believer that religion can help people find their way and give them the kind of meaning, purpose, and belonging that they've been lacking.
Yeah, I wanted to dive into exactly that a bit more. Like you mentioned, there are lots of studies that have found that people who are religious tend to say they're happier than people who aren't. They might be healthier. They're less likely to be depressed, to die by suicide, or to die due to alcoholism. As far as the health goes, I don't think communion wafers are particularly nutritious. I know matzah isn't. So there's definitely something else going on there. And I wanted to hear a little more from you, Shadi, and also from you, Drew, about why you think that is. Why is religion making people happier and healthier?
One thing that stuck with me from my Spanish literature degree in college just through the years is this guy, Miguel de Unamuno, who was an author and philosopher. And he saw reason and faith as in conflict. He was not one of the people who said, actually, we can bridge these two. And then he made kind of just the astonishing decision, I'm just going to choose faith. I'm done wrestling with this. For him, it was the question of mortality, right? He was agonized by the idea of mortality. And he said, I'm going to believe in something that affords me immortality, and I'm just going to live a happy life, right? I think there is so much to religion that is just comforting, like the vision of a better world. All of that just seeps into your psyche over time, and I think makes for a more idealistic person. And then it compounds when you are surrounded by people who share these thoughts with you. I think, obviously, we live in a post-communitarian America, and churches, mosques, synagogues allow people to see the same people over and over again. I was reading some reporting of a church in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and there was a girl who had recently started going to church, and she goes, yeah, I like the idea that at church they can't reject you, which was just funny, but also deeply sad, right?
There's a sign in front of a church that is on one of my frequent running routes that says, no friends, ? And then it tells you when to come to church, and it has a little image of a donut and coffee. The donut part is appealing. I don't know. I hope enough friends, but It's the same idea.
I mean, when I first moved to DC, I was broken up with by my college boyfriend, and I went to church 3 days a week. This is a very, very real phenomenon.
Look, the data is also clear, as you said, Molly. We can disagree on why it's the case, but there's little doubt that religious people are, on average, happier
Yeah.
than not religious people. And so if you're just following the data and you want to be happy, it's probably the way to go. Now,
Right.
the challenge is you can't necessarily will yourself to believe if you don't believe. But I think there's a couple things going on here. I mean, one is very basic, as both of you were saying, that if you are going to church or mosque or synagogue every week, you have a natural group of friends that you can hang out with. You're also more likely to meet your partner in your place of worship, and especially with young men and actually young Americans, in general, they're struggling to get married. They're struggling to find someone they want to spend the rest of their lives with. And the question of values alignment is a very challenging one. But if you're meeting people who share at least some of your spiritual or religious values every week, then there's a better chance that something will work out. This doesn't mean that it works for everyone, but if you're kind of looking at the median, there is a lot that seems to be working positively there.
Yeah, I was thinking about the loneliness thing and about the being with other people. And it was also making me think about the idea of being less alone because you're with God too. And it made me think of, are you there, God? It's me, Margaret. Because she's just lonely. She's having trouble relating to some of the other girls. She's growing up. She feels like she can't talk to her mother the way she wants to talk to her mother. So she talks to God. And I have to admit, I am not particularly religious or spiritual, but I used to chat with God a little before bed. And it was like divorced from Judaism for me.
Of course.
And if I'd interrogated it more deeply, I don't even know that I would have said I believed in anything specific. But I did it. And I think it did make me feel less lonely.
I'm interested in getting more into the question of whether, it's advisable for us to just start joining up and what that even means in a world and a country where religion is so polarized. We'll get into that after the break. Welcome back. I'm Drew Goins, and this is Impromptu. So before the break, we were talking about, if you want to be happier, consider joining a church. That's the direction the data points. But, I will speak personally here. I look out at the landscape of American religion, and it looks like a progressive version of Christianity is very rapidly disappearing. I feel like I better join up now if I want to try to invigorate one of these churches, else I am going to be left with options that are increasingly conservative. And, an anti-gay megachurch in a strip mall probably is not the right fit for me. What do you guys make of how increasingly conservative religion in America seems to be? And is it reversible? Is it inevitable?
Yeah, so I think this is actually why progressives have to stay in the game, because if progressives leave places of worship and kind of give up, then they're kind of ceding the space to conservatives and sometimes, quite frankly, extremists who are, in my view, twisting their respective faiths. And that's why I think over the past few decades, if we look at America, the fact that so many white evangelicals in particular have left the Democratic Party, it creates a kind of fundamental imbalance where now to be religious means that you're more likely to be Republican. To have that association, that kind of partisan element is really unfortunate. And religion should be open and available and belonging to whether you're red or blue. And Obama, in his famous convention speech in 2004, had this incredible line, which was really powerful, that we worship a great God in both blue and red states. But now it's becoming harder to say that. But I think the other part of this is that's so troubling is when I look at the Republican Party, well, first of all, it's led by someone who is really secular in an unprecedented way. Donald Trump doesn't seem to have any interest in Christian ideas. He is interested in weaponizing Christianity for his own gain. But I do get a sense sometimes when you see this kind of executive grab for power and this almost idolatrous way of looking at Donald Trump raising him above as he's this kind of prophetic figure, there's something quite blasphemous, it seems to me, about that. There doesn't seem to be a lot of fear of God, because when I think of fear of God, I think of humility. Because if you're putting God above everything else, that means that you're accepting that you're imperfect, that you're a mere mortal, that you don't have all the right answers to all the questions. To be humble means to admit that maybe your opponents might be right. I don't see that kind of ethic of humility in today's Republican Party.
Shadi, I very much hear what you're saying about not ceding the ground, right? But as a progressive Christian, I'll still claim that mantle. As a progressive Christian myself, part of the reason I stopped going to church was because it felt like every Sunday I was donning my armor and heading out onto the battlefield. It felt like I was fighting to preserve a place for progressive Christianity against the threat of, right-wing Christian nationalism. And that's not the fight that I wanted to be fighting in church. I wanted to be fighting against poverty, right? Liberation theology. But so much of the appeal of religion is, to me at least, is this solace from the grubbiness of politics, right? Not from the grubbiness of the world, because religion has to be in the world. You have to tend to the flocks in the world, but specifically this polarized fight. And the notion of going back and fighting that fight from the pew is just really unappetizing.
Yeah, I think it's a bummer, the politicization of religion, to put it in the least religious way possible. I mean, when we talk about whether religion's a force for good, one of the big problems, I would say, with the country today is that if the idea is that we can overcome the hyper-individualism by finding the sense of commonality, community, and religion provides that, great. But if religion is itself super politicized, then I don't think it's really able to do that. It just runs back into, the same problem of breeding difference, encouraging difference. So it's a shame, which maybe brings me to our discussion about spirituality.
Oh, it definitely brings you to our discussion about spirituality.
It seems to bring you there, so perhaps you should start.
No, please.
The definition of what it means to be spiritual is pretty murky, but Pew did a survey recently, and they asked things like whether people have souls or believe in the afterlife or believe in something spiritual beyond the natural world. And Pew found that tons of Americans believe that. So yeah, why do you guys think more people gravitate to spirituality over religion?
I think we all have this innate sense that there is something beyond us. Now, that doesn't have to be something supernatural, but I think this idea of serving something beyond ourselves, of the world not just being about sensory perception, is very appealing intellectually to a lot of us. But the fact of the matter is that over the past 25 years in particular, we have seen a plummeting in religious attendance and observance, the number of people who pray daily, the list goes on. So something isn't working. There's a kind of disconnect. And I think that spirituality gives people the opportunity to pursue something deeper, even if they don't necessarily like their local church or they feel too constricted by tradition. But then you have this situation where you have people who are believing, but they don't necessarily have the community that undergirds it. Is that sustainable? Are we going to see more and more people maybe reconsidering joining local places of worship? We'll have to wait and see. But the trend lines, unless they reverse, show that there's a fundamental unhappiness with existing religious structures as they currently are, which I think calls for a kind of renewal. The question is, what does renewal actually look like? How much do you keep tradition versus actually maybe pushing tradition to the side and coming up with something new?
Yeah, I think that's perfect.
So for the people who don't like the God or church-like aspects of religion, but might be drawn to that community and sense of belonging, do you see any worthwhile replacements on the ground now?
I think that maybe the closest thing in my life is just being in nature, like standing on top of a mountain, watching the tide come in and out on like the rocky shore somewhere. the certain slant of light that Emily Dickinson talks about, which I think she's really comparing to cathedral music. It's not as much about the community and belonging part of religion, what I'm talking about, but it is about seeing yourself as a smaller part of something bigger, and that bigger thing is both inspiring, awe-inspiring, and comforting. And that's something that you just feel when you're out in the natural world. So that's where I find it.
I think a lot about how wondering at nature is just about the only thing that's older than religion, right? Like, I go to a CrossFit that I love and I get some fulfillment from my CrossFit, right? But the framework that I'm trying to build for myself, I've been doing for 30 years, right? Religion, the natural world, has quite a bit of a jump on that. And I'm nothing I create for myself or that our modern society creates, I think, is going to ever compete with it.
Yeah, and I think this is the problem with trying to find belonging in something like CrossFit or SoulCycle. And I'll just note, even think about the name SoulCycle here. The word soul is right in there. It's not even subtle.
As the Christian of the podcast, let me point out cross as well.
Oh, wow. I hadn't thought of that. It's good.
Martyring yourself for your physique there, Drew?
Well, the problem is that these things are also things that you pay for. And I think that introduces a different kind of consumerist element. And I think a lot of us don't want to fall into that consumerist mode in all the things that we do. We want something that feels more natural and organic. And I think that's why for all of these replacements for religion that we try to come up with, it's really hard to mimic the real thing. You can certainly try, but I just wonder how far that will really go for people. But I do think that whether you're religious or not, one thing that you can do is be less obsessed about politics, because I think being politically obsessed, being very online, always getting in these fights about whatever political issue of the day there is, I think that takes us away from community. It takes us away from spirituality. It takes us, by definition, away from nature. But I think there's different ways of doing that and different ways of searching for those alternatives. But I think we do have to kind of maintain that search.
On that note, Shadi, which sounds pretty good, shall I just say I'll see you guys this weekend at temple or mosque or church? We'll roll a dice for it.
Sounds like a plan.
I can't promise anything.
Thank you so much. It was great talking to the both of you guys.
Yeah, thanks both. That was fun.
Thanks so much.
This episode was produced by Hadley Robinson and Regina DeHeer, edited by Jasmine Green, and mixed by Emma Munger. Special thanks to Millie Mitra and Deirdre Byrne. Thanks for listening to Impromptu. Please send us your thoughts about religion, spirituality, and this conversation at impromptu@washpost.com. And be sure to listen to Impromptu every Tuesday as well to hear our colleague Dana Milbank tackle the biggest political news of the moment. We'll be back in your feeds with more conversation next Friday.